Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be assembling the hinges for the Nuremberg Box project that I've been working on. I have no idea what the actual name of this type of hinge is. I've always called them stack hinges because I usually make them out of a bunch of little pieces that are all piled together. In this case, three parts of the hinge are being attached to a strap that's going to be attached to the lid of the box, and the other two pieces are going to be attached to another strap that's going to be fastened to the actual box. Here you can see a sketch of the overall dimensions of the pieces that I'm going to be cutting out. It's basically just a square piece of metal that's 1.5 inches long and 9/16 wide. I've also cut out some extra pieces that I'm going to be using as spacers so that I can keep everything aligned while I'm working on the hinge. And the material that I'm going to be using is 3/16 of an inch thick. And this sketch represents the top view of each side of the hinge, and you can see where the spacers are used in between the actual plates. These spacers are just used to keep everything aligned while I'm working on the hinge. The actual working part of the hinge is sitting in front of this block, so all of this is going to be cut off and not used in the finished hinge. It's just while I'm making the parts. So here's what the individual pieces look like. I've pre-drilled all of the hole locations with a drill bit that fits some aligning pins that I'm going to be using to fit everything together. And you can also see the scribe line that represents the top edge of the hinge. So the sketch on the left represents the top view of the two parts of this hinge. So I'm going to take 3 of these big plates and space them out with 3 of these smaller spacers, and eventually I'm going to rivet them all together, and I'm going to do the same thing for the other half of the hinge, but just using 2 plates. This system worked well. I've made these hinges before, but I've never actually riveted them together as a unit, so it was a real mess trying to keep track of everything and keeping everything aligned as you were building it. So the actual process was sound and it worked really well. The only problem I had is that these spacers were way too small. I should have made them 2, maybe 3 times the size, so there'd be a lot more bearing surface to keep everything sturdy and aligned. The opposite end of the hinge is going to have some tenons cut into it, and each unit is going to be riveted and brazed to a mounting plate. Here you can see how this system allows me to check the alignment of everything, and it also allows me to clamp everything in place so that I can work with it as a unit. If everything is lined up properly, all of these aligning pins should be parallel with each other, and they should all be sitting at 90 degrees to the sides of the hinge. The process that I'm going to be using is I'll be removing one aligning pin at a time. I'll be drilling out that hole to the size for the rivet that I'm going to be using, and then I'm going to set that rivet. I'm not going to rivet it all the way. I'm just going to fasten it to a point where it's snug. Once I have all the rivets set, I'm going to check the alignment one more time, and then I'm going to rivet everything together so that everything is being held firmly in place. And this part of the process is the main problem that I had with the spacers. They were a little too small, so sometimes the plates tended to roll around a little bit, or they were hard to keep aligned. So everything worked out well, but a larger spacer would have simplified this whole process. So at this point, assembling is pretty straightforward. You just have to make sure you have really solid guidelines, and you have to work to those lines. You can't deviate. Take your time. Don't do it when you're in a hurry. Just pace yourself and make sure that everything's right before you move on. You've heard me say that about just about everything that's involved in blacksmithing or anything else. Just take your time, know what the process is, follow the steps. This sketch represents the plate that's actually going to be mounted to the back of the box, and it's going to have two of the hinge sections mounted to it. So everything on this plate has to be 100% right, otherwise the two sides of the hinge are going to be fighting each other. The top lid has, two hinge plates, so if something's a little off, you have room to play with. But here, once everything's riveted and brazed in place, if it isn't right, your hinge is going to bind, it's not going to swing freely. So the main reference line that I'm using is that horizontal reference line that goes right through the center of the plate. Everything is referenced off of that. The sides of the plate are scribed in. I have to make sure that those lines are 90 degrees to that center line. And I also have to make sure that the center line for the pivot pin of the hinge is also directly over top of that center line. This darker square shows how the hinge pin should be sitting in relation to the center line. You can see how it's directly over top of the center line and it's parallel to that center line. If you turn this to the side, the pivot pin should also be exactly the same height above the back plate. So you shouldn't have one side of the pin higher than the other. Any direction you look at this, you should be seeing straight, square, angles to each other. So here's what this plate looks like halfway done. You can see on the left I've started drilling out the holes and then cutting out the slots. This is the same stuff that you've seen me do several times through this process, and it's identical to what I demonstrated in the last video. On the right you can see the hinge blank that's set in place. Once I get everything to this point and I'm happy with the alignment, I'm going to take all three pieces to the fire and I'm going to braze each one of the hinge blocks in place. Once that's done, I'll be able to cut off the end of the hinge with all the rivets and the spacers, and I'll be able to actually fit the two pieces together and see how everything works. Here I'm quite a bit further along and I have all that preliminary work done, and I'm using a file to start roughing in the overall shape of the hinge. The main thing that I'm working on here is the radius that needs to be filed in around the center of the pivot pin. I'm going to be filing a profile that looks okay, and then I'm going to be moving the section of hinge, and that'll show me any irregularities that need to be removed. So I'm just going to continue that process until I have something that looks fairly smooth and is not too wonky. You have to remember this hinge is really going to be buried inside this box, and the only time you're going to see it is when the lid is actually fully opened. At the rest of the time there's going to be moldings and you're not actually going to see the hinge unless you turn the box upside down. So this section that I'm filing right now is really the only section that really has to look good. So I'm going to concentrate on that, make sure that everything's smooth. If I need to, I'm going to return it to the fire to just bring it up to a very, very dull red and work it, do some medieval machining to make sure that everything runs smoothly, and break out, any scale or anything that might be caught in between there, and I'll quench it in oil so that it is fully lubricated and everything's working smoothly. So take your time with this process as well, and because if something goes wrong here, if you remove too much material, you're starting over. So here's what the finished hinge looks like in its current state. There's still a lot more to do, of course. First of all, that nail needs to be turned into a proper pivot pin, and everything's going to be brought to a file finish before I assemble it in the lock. But as far as a working piece, everything's fine. Everything's lined up. You can see how that nail is sitting where it should be. It's perfectly in line with the back plate, and there is a little bit of a wobble in this hinge, but it's still very tight, and it doesn't feel sloppy at all. So once the hinge pin is riveted in place, all of that is going to go away, and it won't be visible because you're not going to have these two rods sticking out of the side of the hinge. So everything worked out great. Again, riveting everything together was definitely the way to go. It certainly was a lot easier than trying to keep track of 20 little pieces of metal. So if you're thinking of doing something like this, I would recommend this process. It worked out really well. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you have any questions, you can contact me by using the email address that I have shown here. If you like the channel and the work that I'm doing, please consider becoming a patron. Every dollar you contribute will bring me one step closer to being able to produce videos full-time.